I want to welcome you to Between Skepticism and Mysticism, an introduction to the occult philosophy of Cornelius Agrippa. This entire lecture series on the foundations of the occult philosophy is brought to you totally free of charge, completely open access by the incredibly generous folks that support my work over at my Patreon. This is all a bit of an experiment on providing free content through crowdsourcing education on topics that are just honestly rarely taught in universities at all. And when they are taught, a single class can cost thousands of dollars. If you'd like to support the production of university level open access education and topics in Western esotericism, I'd hope you consider taking a look at my Patreon, which you can join for as little as $54 a year. It's like buying me a cup of coffee or a beer once a month. But thank you so much for your consideration of supporting the channel and the work like this, and thanks to the patrons of this channel for making this lecture series possible. All right, everyone, welcome back. And I really want to say a very hearty welcome back because in some sense, we've jumped the hurdle out of the occult philosophy. We're going to come back to it, of course. We're never going to be far away from the orbit of the occult philosophy of Agrippa. But now, in a substantial sense, we're moving beyond the 1510 juvenile draft, which I don't like to call it either juvenile or draft. I think I've mentioned this before. Agrippa was 23 at the time that he wrote it, and it is not a draft. It is, in fact, a complete text. And so, in many ways, I don't like to call it either juvenile or draft. But at any rate, the 1510 version of the three books of occult philosophy, and for many people, the 1510 or the 1533 version of the three books of occult philosophy is in some sense Agrippa. It's as if Agrippa wrote that and then dipped out of history. And or there's that, and then there's the De Vanitate, the De Incertitudine, his work on skepticism. And often people who really like his work on skepticism don't really care about his work on occultism, and people who like his work on occultism would love it if the De Incertitudine were never written. It seems to be a very inconvenient fact for many people who are much more interested in Agrippa as an occultist. We'll, of course, come back to the De Incertitudine here starting next week, I believe, depending on how far we get into in today's talk. But at any rate, crucially important to understand about Agrippa is that Agrippa did not stop speculating and did not stop learning and did not stop thinking and perhaps doing, to whatever degree he was in fact doing, something like mysticism, something like occultism, perhaps like magic, although again we don't have good evidence for that. And certainly, as I showed in this recent week's episode, that certainly Agrippa was very much interested in the practice of alchemy and never abandoned that, even after the so-called skeptical turn of 1526. At any rate, what's crucially important to know is that after 1510, Agrippa is going to do two things that are going to matter a great deal. The first thing he's going to do is he's going to go to England very briefly. We don't know exactly when he was in England. He was there in what is called a most quite different and most secret affair. Probably, of course, as you'll remember from the sort of Life and Times, he is there under the aegis of Maximilian the First, probably working there in the diplomatic service. He may have also been working there as a soldier. Remember, Agrippa has some expertise soldiering, and one of the things we'll see in a minute is he does quite a bit of apologizing for his existence as a soldier. At any rate, in England, two very important things happened there. We know that he composes a work that seemingly to him was extremely important, and that work was a commentary on the book of Romans by the Apostle Paul. We know it's very important because Agrippa mentions it several times in his letters, and also it's one of the major works that when it goes missing after Francis I invades France, invades Milan, a good bit of Agrippa's works go missing, and the one that he sort of laments over the most is his commentary on the book of Romans. So we don't know what was in that. I have some. I'd be willing to speculate about that, maybe on a live stream or something. I think very much it had to do with honing in on the doctrine of grace and faith operating there in the book of Romans, probably in a similar way that we see people like Melanchthon and Luther focus in on it, although I think with quite a different focus coming from the particular interest that Agrippa has in the concept of felicity. At any rate, it would be in England that Agrippa would also come into contact with John Colet. And for folks who know a little bit about John Colet, he is an interesting character. in that Colet is something of a reform-minded person, although I would say that in England at the time, he's one of the most learned people as to what's going on down in Italy with people like Pico, Reuchlin, of course, Reuchlin's being German, and Ficino. Now, what's important about Colet is that Colet knows a lot of what's going on in this sort of occult, hermetic, Kabbalistic revival, but is very skeptical of it. He thinks that basically it's interesting. There are some things to be learned here, but we shouldn't really, go whole hog in this sort of hermetic Renaissance business. So Colet, as much as again we don't know because we don't have any information about what Agrippa was doing here, we do know that he met with Colet. We do know that he says in a letter that he learned an enormous amount from Colet. And if the influence of Colet would have been anything, I suspect that it would have had the effect of pumping the brakes on the kind of extreme enthusiasm that we see in the 1510 three books of occult philosophy. So it might be the case, and again, I have to be careful here because I'm doing some speculating because we don't know, that Colet would have been the kind of guy that would have pushed Agrippa more in the direction of Orthodox Christianity, maybe a little bit away from the hardcore emphasis, especially on magic, and he would have been able to done that via an imminent critique of the kind of stuff coming out of the Ficino, Pico, Reuchlin milieu. Is that the case? We don't know. But that is Colet, and Agrippa did speak very highly of Colet when he was there on this quite different and most secret affair in London. And again, he did compose a very important document, at least important for him, the commentary on the Book of Romans by the Apostle Paul. Now, just to put this out there, anyone who's listening who is in the Milan area, you should know that Agrippa's works do pop up from time to time. We have found works of Agrippa just sort of in archives. I would say that it's eminently possible that that Agrippa's works might have survived. Again, Milan was in a bit of chaos when it was invaded by the French, but people tended to stow things away. And I would not be surprised if one day we do not find the lost commentary on Romans by Agrippa. And if we do, it would be a tremendous moment in filling in some of the moving parts of what's going on here in the so-called Italian period. At any rate, what does end up happening is that in 1511, Agrippa does go into Italy. He's going to move extensively through Italy under the employ of Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor. And Agrippa's going to spend the better part of 7 years in Italy. And it would be in Italy where, contrary to the way we think about the trajectory of Agrippa's intellectual life, such that he writes the 1510 draft of the three books of occult philosophy, and then 16 years later composes the De Incertitudine, and that those are the two works that sort of represent the Agrippan mental headspace. The truth of the matter is actually much more complicated. And the truth of the matter is this: during the Italian period, there is every bit of evidence that Agrippa was full steam ahead, especially on deepening his knowledge of the Hermetica and deepening his knowledge of Kabbalah. So those two elements, as witnessed by his letters and witnessed by what he wrote during that period, and also his lectures, are full steam ahead on those two. Now, there is one thing that we'll mention here toward the end that seems to go completely silent in the works of Agrippa from the period, or the Italian period, from 1511. What Agrippa basically goes completely silent on, interestingly enough, is magic. Magic basically disappears from Agrippa's vocabulary. In fact, of the works, and I went through every single one of the works written during the Italian period, including the ones that we've worked on translating and the ones that we have not worked on translating. I looked through all of them. To my knowledge, magic gets mentioned in all of those works exactly once, just once. So this is a huge shift in Agrippa's way of talking. And so we'll get into sort of what that means and what the implications for that might mean toward the end of the lectures here on the Italian period, assuming that we get through all of them today. So what did Agrippa compose? What did Agrippa do during the Italian period? So there are 4 major works that are composed during the Italian period. The first would be published or be given in 1515. This is the beginning of a series of lectures on the Corpus Hermeticum. We have fragments of the first of those on the Hermetic Pimander. We have a book written in 1515, 1516. We don't know exactly when, but it is a book on love. Specifically, it is a discussion of love as it is found in the Ficino edition of Plato's Symposium, and also in conversation with Ficino's commentary on the Symposium. So it is a kind of a hyper commentary written by Agrippa. I'll talk more about all these in just a moment, but it is a book about love. This is Agrippa at his most hippie. We have a book written, or a text written in 1515, 1516, called The Dialogue on Man, or The Dialogue on the Human Being. This text is a bit of a difficult text to try to grasp exactly what it is. It seems like it was originally going to be a dialogue style document about Agrippa, where Agrippa was going to lay out his theory of anthropology, specifically his very Neoplatonic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic anthropology. What it looks like happened is that Agrippa gave a series of what he called sermones to several of his friends, and that those sermones were going to become this dialogos de homine. And ultimately, what ends up happening is that chunks of it are kind of pulled out and then used for other documents. So it seems to be a fragment of a partially aborted work that ultimately Agrippa never completes, and we only have it in a fragmentary state in the Agrippa opera. And lastly, in the 1515 or 1516, we have Agrippa's essay on the three ways of knowing God. This is the most complete. This is, in fact, it is a complete essay. It's 6 chapters long or so. It is a complete essay, and it is something that we get in the sense of Agrippa's religious epistemology. So it is a text of epistemology written by Agrippa. And again, I want to just lay out here what we're having. We have a theory of love, which, as you remember from the 3 books of occult philosophy, love in many ways is the philosophical apex before felicity, whether through the Venusian frenzy or through the experience of divine love. So love is still lingering very much on the mind of Agrippa. We have him lecturing on the Hermetic Pimander, so he's still very much interested in Hermeticism. His religious anthropology. Remember also, at the core of the 3 books of occult philosophy is the human being and the unique place of the human being in the cosmos for Agrippa, the chain, or the chain of the universe, the knot of the cosmos, as Agrippa likes to use that language from Ficino. And lastly, we have a document on Agrippa's epistemology, which is to say how Agrippa thinks knowledge happens. How do we gain true knowledge of the world? There are a couple things I want to point out about all these documents. The first thing I want to point out about them is that there's no fundamental break between the Agrippa of 1510 and these documents. Agrippa's drilling down into topics that he'd already scratched the surface of in the 3 books of occult philosophy of 1510. He's now expanding those ideas into larger individual documents. And further, what's missing, again, is magic. None of these works deal with magic. So what's odd is the 3 books of occult philosophy obviously begins and ends with a great deal of magic. That's part of the reason why people love the text. These 4 documents have virtually no reference to magic whatsoever. I think literally one reference in the 3 ways of knowing God that we'll come back to in just a minute. But crucial to all these, right, is that we're not seeing a break. We're seeing Agrippa double down. Also notice there's about a 5-year gap. So Agrippa completes the 1510, 3 books. He composes something of a document in maybe 1511 before he goes to England. He's over there in London. He composes the book, the commentary on Romans. And then it takes him 4 years. I don't know about you, 4 years is a long time for intellectual development. And then we see all of a sudden in 1515 sort of a rapid fire composition of several works, all of which I would argue are extensions of texts that are already at some level, or at least extensions of ideas already operative in the 3 books of occult philosophy, that Agrippa is deepening his thinking, not abandoning it, with the possible exception of the centrality of magic. Just as a spoiler, so folks will know this is coming, Dana Trell, a great friend and colleague, Dana Trell and I are working on and have completed translations of 3 of these. We are translating, Dan's translating and working together on the Pavia lecture, and the 3 ways of knowing God, along with some of the in material from the 3 books of occult philosophy, but more on that coming shortly. At any rate, if you want to consult these, they are in the second volume of the complete works of Cornelius Agrippa, and you can find it online on archive.org. So let's get into them. Let's talk about what Agrippa is writing at this time. And some of these writings will be available in an English translation, hopefully in the next month or so. So be on the lookout for that. I'll obviously make an announcement on the channel when these will be available. The Pimander lecture. So as you probably know, the Hermetic Pimander is the first of the Hermetic logoi. It is without a doubt the most famous of the Hermetic logoi, perhaps with Asclepius. But the Hermetic Pimander is the first of what have been a lecture series given by Agrippa at the University of Pavia, where he was publicly lecturing on the centrality of the Hermetic philosophy and its importance. What's good about this is that we have the first one, kind of. It's a fragment. We don't have the entire lecture. And so, unfortunately, the entire lecture does not survive. We don't have any of the subsequent lectures that he gave either. And we do know that ultimately the lecture series had to come to an end because basically, they were being militarily invaded and Agrippa had to get out of Dodge. So, unfortunately, we don't have the rest of these. And further, most of what happens in the very beginning of these lecture series is mostly Agrippa basically, I don't know what the right way of saying this is, kissing up, licking the boot. He's ingratiating himself in the courtly life in the world of the University of Pavia, basically trying to argue that he should be given a job in some sense. So the document itself is mostly him kind of disclaiming himself and then heaping praise upon the kinds of people who are supporting him to do this. So unfortunately, a lot of the text is not driven by the content of him talking about the Hermetic Pimander. That's unfortunate, but it is what it is, and this is what we have. In fact, a lot of it is Agrippa basically arguing that he has to people should forgive him this for lecturing on something so sacred and so mystical, despite the fact that he himself is a mere soldier. You'll remember that he did in fact soldier, and the whole business of the adventure at Barcelona. So a good bit of the text is taken up with that. So what do we get from Agrippa's first lecture on the Hermetic Pimander? Mostly it's story setting. What he's doing is showing the history, as much as he understood it, of who Hermes Trismegistus was. And there are a couple things that are worth interest in mentioning here that he does mention. The first is that he identifies Hermes Trismegistus with Enoch. Enoch and Hermes Trismegistus are identified by Agrippa. This is something you'll probably recognize from the Islamic tradition. In the Islamic tradition, Idris is identified with Hermes Trismegistus. That is a thing that typically doesn't happen in the Christian world, and exactly where Agrippa got that connection is not clear to me. But it certainly could have come across in Islamic sources, especially in alchemical sources, where Agrippa could have gotten that connection. But what's crucially important about this is by basically linking Hermes Trismegistus with Enoch, he's able to get around the fact that Hermes Trismegistus is pagan. He's able to basically sneak him into the Bible, sneak him in to the world of Judeo-Christian holy people. And of course, with him being identified with Enoch, he gets all of the benefits of being Enoch, and he gets none of the detriment of having been the pagan Egyptian Hermes Trismegistus. So this is an interesting move, and a similar move that happens in the Islamic tradition. And of course, once he's able to do that, he makes the argument basically that Enoch / Hermes Trismegistus has basically given the world everything that is good about the world. He has given the world the alphabet. He's given the world laws. He's given the world gems, like gems in the sense of flexing gems, like everything that is good in civilization. Enoch / Hermes Trismegistus was able to distribute to the Greeks and to the Egyptians, having written tens of thousands of books. That issue of him writing tens of thousands of books is very important because in some sense, because Hermes Trismegistus has written everything and given all this wisdom, he was also able to basically say all of the wisdom that has come down to us, no matter what it is ultimately derived from Hermes Trismegistus, and therefore it is not pagan because Hermes Trismegistus is Enoch. He's one of the patriarchs. This is an interesting rhetorical move that Agrippa makes. So basically, to baptize Hermes Trismegistus, if you like, and therefore make all of the pagan knowledge that has come down to us basically kosher, if I'm allowed to mix my metaphors here, to make it kosher so that the paganism that otherwise taints Hermes Trismegistus is in some sense significantly alleviated, at least from a rhetorical point of view. Further, Hermes Trismegistus was not only a philosopher, but he was a prophet. And two of the things that Agrippa argues for is that Hermes saw the end of paganism. He was witness to the end. He prophesied the end of paganism, and also he saw the coming of Christ. Now, that issue of foreseeing the end of paganism, I suspect that what Agrippa has in mind is what is sometimes referred to as the Hermetic Apocalypse. You may know that in the Asclepius, there is a moment where the writer of that text goes into a kind of complaint about the fact that Egyptian civilization is collapsing, that we're forced to use Greek letters which lack energy, to use the term that's used there in the Asclepius. And in the writer of the Asclepius is lamenting the end of traditional Egyptian culture. Now, what Agrippa, I think, does is take the Hermetic Apocalypse and basically say, no, that's Enoch, in some sense predicting the end of paganism and seeing eventually the coming of Christ. Now, not only does he see the coming of Christ, but he identifies Christ with Pimander. So this is a pretty shocking move that Agrippa makes. He's not the first to make it. The first person to make this move, of course, was Ludovico Lazzarelli, who I'm absolutely sure Agrippa is leaning on Lazzarelli to make this move. But if you remember that scene from the Pymander shows up in this uh, body of glory, this body of light. And for Agrippa, basically what he argues is that Christ and Pymander are the exact same entity, and therefore further distancing the Trismegistan literature and the Trismegistan tradition from paganism, moving it away from the world of paganism into the world of being Christian. So much so that for folks who will know this image is it's in the cathedral at Siena. This is literally an image of Hermes Trismegistus in the floor at the Siena Cathedral. I've seen it. That's Hermes Trismegistus in conversation, sort of looming over Moses, where in some sense Trismegistus is seen as giving Moses wisdom. Now, that image being in a cathedral shows you, in some sense, how thoroughgoing these kinds of ideas were in the Italian world, where what is ostensibly a prophet, a pagan wise man, Hermes Trismegistus, has been so thoroughly, I don't know what's the right word, in some sense, baptized, or some good bit of revisionist history, are so radically detorned that we no longer have a pagan Egyptian, but we have a pre-Christian embodiment of Christianity and Christ in the form of Pymander, and Hermes Trismegistus in the form, of course, of Enoch. Further, Enoch, of course, as you probably know, did not die. He's one of the two people in the Bible that allegedly did not die, Elijah being the other, Enoch being the first. The Hebrew Bible simply says that Enoch walked with God and he was no more. And the tradition, of course, is that Enoch was taken bodily into heaven. In some traditions, he was transformed into the angel Metatron in some traditions. But at any rate, the fact that Hermes Trismegistus is not dead is extremely important, in the sense that the tradition of Hermes is not only so sacred that God took Hermes Trismegistus / Enoch bodily into heaven, but that Enoch in some sense is still around, that he is not dead. And so there's a kind of Hermes is still alive, Trismegistus is still alive, and the wisdom of Trismegistus is therefore all the more true, because he never had to even suffer from the one thing that we know that everyone who is infected with original sin has to suffer, is death. And Hermes Trismegistus avoided that fate. in this particular version articulated here by Agrippa. Further, extending on this sort of Lazarellian point, insofar as Pimander is Christ, the point made by Lazarelli, insofar as Pymander is Christ, and Pymander teaches Hermes Trismegistus all this wisdom, the Corpus Hermeticum itself becomes a kind of gospel. If you think about it, it becomes a kind of proto-gospel because it is Christ teaching a disciple, Hermes Trismegistus, and then Hermes Trismegistus writing down that good news. And therefore, not only is Trismegistus becomes not only a kind of non-pagan, the Corpus Hermeticum becomes a kind of proto-gospel. Now, this move is, I think, just absolutely shocking that Agrippa would say this in public in Italy, the stronghold of Catholicism in Pavia, in a public lecture, basically completely collapsing Christianity and Hermeticism. They become identical. And in fact, I'll push this even further. Insofar as older is more true, as more ancient is closer to the source, then we have to, by that logic, also go a step further, a step that Agrippa never says publicly, but has to be in the back of his mind, if not in the front of his mind, and you just seem to need to read between the lines. If the Corpus Hermeticum is older, it therefore is better than the Gospels that come later, because those Gospels are in some sense downstream of a more primeval revelation. And so in many ways, this collapse that happens in the Hermetic lecture at 1515, we go from the Corpus Hermeticum being pagan wisdom taught by an Egyptian to becoming, no, Hermes Trismegistus is in fact Enoch and was so holy he was taken bodily into heaven. He never died, and Christ taught him things directly. He recorded that in writing, and that becomes a kind of metaphysical gospel. Now, the fact that he lectured on that publicly boggles my mind. It shows you how much, in some sense, you could get away with at this time. It shows you also where the kind of window was, right? Where the kind of window was for what was sayable in public. Hermeticism, in some sense, had pervaded the intellectual world, at least in Italy, enough that Agrippa could say things that I think are pretty patently heretical. I mean, they sound crazy that you could say something like that publicly. But this is the direction that Agrippa's wanting to go. He never makes really any of those kinds of claims in the 3 books of occult philosophy. But here, he's not only just doubling down on Hermeticism, he's simply saying there is, in fact, no Christianity that is not also Hermeticism. That Hermeticism and Christianity are not compatible, that they are fundamentally the same thing. They are revelations. They are the same revelation that's happened over and over and over again in history. And it is just now because of the divine work of Ficino that we now have a gospel that has been otherwise lost in the form of the Corpus Hermeticum. It's mind-blowing. I mean, there's a reason why I think this was never translated. I think it's never translated because this is pushing Hermeticism further, I think, than Lazarelli ever intended to push it. And I think pushing it in a frankly will be, I think, a heretical direction, in fact. But this point, I think, is incredible, is really, really important. And again, it shows you Agrippa has not abandoned the occult philosophy. If anything else, Agrippa has doubled down on his commitment to Hermeticism, fusing it with Christianity in a logical way, in a historical way, in a way that in some sense says what we have in the Corpus Hermeticum is in fact a gospel before the gospels that we have in the Bible. Just an impressive point made by Agrippa in a public lecture, University, 1515. I think quite interesting. At the same time, around the same time, right, what we also get in Agrippa is we get his lecture on love. Now, the lecture on love, I have to admit, is again, it's wonderful, it's beautiful. We're not going to be working on translating it, I'll just say a few things about it before we move on. But this is Agrippa where he's again taking up a theme very, very important in the 1510 three books of occult philosophy. Recall that love is the fundamental highway, so to speak, by one which climbs, in some sense, the highest rungs of the metaphysical system. The Venusian frenzy is what it was sort of unlocks one's potential to ultimately be illuminated by divine love. It is love that does all the heavy lifting in the occult philosophy, and that'll be clear why that is in just a moment. But what we have in these lectures on Plato's Symposium is that, as you probably know, the Symposium is first translated by Ficino into Latin, and then Ficino writes a very important commentary on the Symposium. Still very beautiful and worth reading. Again, a study group I'd love to do would be a study group on Ficino's commentaries. Agrippa is also very taken with the importance of love. And Agrippa is also coming at the tradition of love via the Augustan tradition, and especially via the mystical tradition inaugurated by Bernard of Clairvaux. If you've never done yourself the favor of reading Bernard of Clairvaux's sermons on the Song of Solomon, do it. It is ground floor, one of the most, if not, it is one of the most, I won't say the most, because Suda Dionysius is the most important, but absolutely top 5 most important mystical works ever produced in the Western mystical tradition is Bernard of Clairvaux's sermons on the Songs of Solomon. And those put love at the very center of the entire mystical metaphysics of Bernard's theology. Now, Agrippa is leaning into that tradition in this text in an extremely hard way. He's leaning into Bernard, and he's leaning very much into the Augustan tradition, epistemologically and in terms of love. And what Agrippa basically farms out of it in a bit of a mishmash of a text, frankly, it almost reads like stream of consciousness when you actually read it. It's just almost sometimes like staccato random sentences about love. It's a very strange little essay. In fact, I was reading through it to prepare for this lecture, and sometimes there's no logical connection between sentences. It's just like Agrippa's just throwing love, everything he knows about love, into a book. It's almost like the notes for something else. I'm not sure exactly what to make of it. But at any rate, what Agrippa develops in the oration on love is he develops a theology of love, he develops an ethics of love, and he develops an epistemology of love. Now, 2 of those should not be terribly surprising. A theology of love, of course, one can do that, right? If you read the Gospel of John, you'll know that God is love. An ethics of love also is not surprising, because that's also typical of the Christian tradition, the Augustan tradition. Love thy neighbor as thyself. You must love your enemy according to Jesus. That's cake baked right in to Christianity. But an epistemology of love, that is something I think is interestingly Agrippan, which is to say that true knowledge of the world is only achievable through an act of love. That is to say, both divine love, that God loves us, but also in loving God, that circuit, right? The circuit of love in which we are participating in that love, that allows us at some level to grasp the fundamental nature of reality. What is the fundamental nature of reality? It's God, and God is love. And therefore, if God, insofar as God is love, it is only through love that one can have any knowledge of what this is. So, what we get here is a participation in the divine, a methexis in the divine, a participation in the divine, and that participation occurs in love, and not just in love, but only in love. And therefore, there is a theurgy of love too, in which, insofar as God's love is what holds the universe together, is what the universe is an expression of God's love, insofar as creation is an act of love, insofar as we are acting in the world through love, we are co-participating with God in the co-creation, in the co-realization of reality itself. So love for Agrippa is at the ground floor of what it is to know God, what it is to be in reality, what it is to be with people, and what it is to know anything. Because outside of love, you are alienated from God, and therefore you're alienated from reality, and therefore you can have no knowledge of it. This is an epistemology of love. So again, the act of love is participating in love, which is again to do the theurgical work of, again, being in reality. And of course, it is only through love that we can make the ascent to the divine at all. So, this, of course, links up to the Agrippan concern over felicity. Felicity is only possible through love. How else would it be possible? God's nature is love. And insofar as we're going to make the ascent to love, we only can make that ascent. I think it's in maybe in book 2. We only make the ascent through love. So again, Agrippa is not breaking at all with what he says in the 3 books of occult philosophy. Rather than not breaking, he's just doubling down on it and saying, let me write a whole bunch more about love to really flesh out all the stuff I was saying in the 3 books. Further, if we're going to do science for Agrippa, science, natural philosophy, we can only do that via love. Because all of this is an expression of God's love, every time anything happens is an expression of God's love. Cause and effect are simply the result of God loving reality, loving us, so the world works. That we study that, right? That we study nature is also born fundamentally out of an act of love. And what do we find in nature? We discover God's love. So, born out of love, we investigate an act of love, an expression of love in nature. And what do we find? The fact that the universe behaves the way that it does, in the beneficent way that it does, what we discover in it is love. So, this is like Agrippa at his most profoundly hippie. It's just love, love, love. All you need is love. It's love everywhere. It's a profusion of love. Also, there is a metaphysical ethics at work here as well. Insofar as love is the fundamental metaphysical structure of reality, it is the fundamental nature of God, it is how we come to know the universe, and it is what we discover in the universe. It is also the place where, when we get it wrong, we commit the worst moral failure, the conversion of love into lust, which is to say, the perversion of love away from a divine act, but rather as a way of personally gratifying our basest of instincts. And therefore, when love is depraved and becomes separate from, or rather becomes alienated, when love is confused with pure physical pleasure, therefore that is where we, in some sense, make the greatest break with the divine. And in fact, Agrippa, I think if I remember correctly, there is a pretty famous moment in the Gospels where it says, "Look, if you commit a sin against me, it's one thing. Sins against God or against me are forgivable. Sins against the Father are forgivable, but sins against the Holy Spirit are unforgivable." For Agrippa, this is the sin against the Holy Spirit. It is the intentional act of alienating yourself from love, converting love into a depraved form of itself, and then indulging in that depravity. Agrippa thinks this is a huge, huge, huge moral failure, perhaps the greatest of all moral failures, because why did Christ come here? Came here for love, and if you convert that love into something depraved, it is an absolute betrayal, not just of God's great mercy, but in some sense a betrayal of all reality. And again, Agrippa reaches a kind of fever pitch at the end of the text. You'll remember that Agrippa's just gotten married around this time, right? Agrippa's met and married his Italian wife, and so he has love on the mind. Apparently, and in fact, he seems to have really loved this wife a great deal. He speaks about her in glowing terms. In the rare places that he does speak about her, we don't know her name, but he talks very highly of her. He seems to have really, really fallen in love with this Italian lady. And at the very end of it, there's a kind of um, uh, admonition by Agrippa that if we are to be in the world, that we must love the world. We must love the world. And how do we love the world? We must love God. We must love our spouse. He mentions his wife. One maybe even imagines that she's in the room at the time. We must love our patria, the idea that we must love our homeland. We must love the sovereign, of course. You got to love your sovereign, otherwise won't be loving anything. You have to love your parents, and you have to love each other. To me, this reminds me a great deal of the Stoic concept of oikiosis. Oikiosis is how you become familiar to the world by extending the sense of familiarity beyond yourself. Like, I'm familiar with myself and I'm familiar with my family. Well, insofar as I'm familiar with my family, I can be familiar with my neighbors. Insofar I can be familiar with my neighbors because they're like my family, like myself, I can be familiar with my city, my polis. And the idea is that Stoics have the idea that through this kind of extending love outwards in the form of oikiosis, one could become familiar with the wider world, and therefore one could become a cosmopolitan person. This is a term invented by the Stoics, in which the cosmos is your polis, and therefore you are just as at home with a foreigner than you are with anyone else, thus breaking down the classic idea that there is a distinction to be made between people who live in a polis and those on the outside as barbarians. Nothing human is foreign to me. And this is, I think, an idea that you see this oikiosis style. You begin here and love and love and love and love and love. And Agrippa goads us into that in a strong way. But again, if you're interested in this metaphysics and this mysticism of love, many people associate this with Sufism. And of course, there's good reason to associate it with Sufism because it's all over Sufism. There's also a very important strand of this within Christianity, primarily again beginning with Augustine, but really reaching its zenith, in my opinion, in Bernard of Clairvaux. And I will be doing an episode on Bernard of Clairvaux and his sermon on the Song of Solomon. It's a fantastic tour de force piece of literature, and Agrippa makes mention of it on several occasions here. The dialogue on man, as I mentioned, is a bit of a fragmentary text. It was given as a section of sermones. Now, sermons is not quite the way we should translate this. These are sort of like private speeches that you would give to your friends, and it's kind of like a workshop. If you've ever done like a writing workshop where you read your works to your friends, it's sort of like he's workshopping some stuff. Now, dialogues, of course, at this time were extremely popular. People wrote dialogues about all kinds of stuff. Ludovico Lazzarelli's Crater Hermetis is a dialogue between him and a king. But at any rate, it looks like it was originally intended to be uh, a, um, a dialogue about the fundamental nature of human beings. But it looks like Agrippa either abandoned it or didn't quite finish it, and then he ultimately ended up cannibalizing it for other things that he would ultimately end up writing. So it never became a full text in a robust sense, but we do have the fragments of it that do survive. And in this sense, we do get a few interesting things that Agrippa is working out. And again, what's important about this text is that it is an expression of Agrippa's anthropology. Now, Agrippa's anthropology is very important because, as I mentioned earlier, for Agrippa being a Hermeticist, the human being is the knot of the cosmos. Now, I keep using that phrase all the time, but that is the way Agrippa always talks about the human being. We are the star of the show, and there's no shaking that in the Hermetic version or the Agrippan version of the anthropology. We are the star of the show because, again, we are the nexus of the world of being and the world of becoming. Our soul is bound up in the world of being. Our body is bound up in the world of becoming, and we are the unique nexus, unlike any other thing, which has the ability to dwell in the world of becoming, but aspire to and achieve communion with the world of being. And therefore, Agrippa is always going to be interested in getting into the nature of the human being, because the human being is in many ways far more interesting than, for instance, angels. Angels are terribly uninteresting compared to the human being, and therefore Agrippa spends a great deal of time thinking about the nature of the human being. But what we get in the dialogue on man is that the human being was, and this is a point that he takes from some Christian traditions, but I think this point is actually being derived primarily from the Kabbalistic tradition, is that the human being was originally a single sex entity. In the Kabbalistic tradition, you may know the human being was one sort of hermaphrodite. I don't like to use that term, but that is the traditional term. It was a male body and a female body fused together into one united body, often thought of as either split down the middle or back to back. Although in many Kabbalistic traditions, we began face to face. The hermaphrodite was face to face, and in a sort of a breaking of the symmetry, they faced away and then split apart. And this is sort of the great dissolution of paradise. At any rate, Agrippa seems to know this Kabbalistic tradition and seems to think of us as originally as a single-sexed entity, a single-gendered entity, maybe a non-gendered entity for that matter, whatever gender and sexuality mean here in Agrippa's thinking. But not only were we duly combined in terms of the sexes, we were also equally human and divine. Now, this is an extremely interesting point that Agrippa makes that must be borne in mind with the conception of Christ. Recall that Christ is also thought of as completely human and completely divine. For Agrippa, the original Adam was also in some sense at least partially human and partially divine. They were mixed together in some sense. They were it was part of a they were part of a mixed entity of divinity and humanity. The fall, which we'll talk about next time with Agrippa's essay on the fall of man, what ends up happening is in the fall, it's born out of a sexual encounter, which again you can imagine Agrippa has somewhat not sexual encounter but a lustful sexual encounter. What we ultimately have is that the human being is split in two ways along two axes. The one axis splits the human being into male and female. Interestingly enough, Agrippa thinks this is the initial act of alienation, that the gendering of the human beings is a type of alienation. So there is a very queer reading of Agrippa's theory of the human being, that gender itself is bad, that we should not lean into our genders in this sort of old school sort of I'm trad and I'm leaning into being masculine and the divine feminine, the divine masculine. There is no divine feminine, divine masculine for Agrippa. The only divinity is the fusion of the two. So this symmetry breaks, and that is part of the fall. The other symmetry that breaks is that the divine element within us is either greatly restricted and or it is alienated from us. So it seems like in some sense the divinity was diffused through our body. We maybe had a different kind of body, and then it sort of is constricted to like a pinprick of divinity, just the last tiny image of the Tselem Elohim, the image of God that we're made in. And what ends up happening is original sin disrupts these fundamental unities. And the task, of course, of the human being is to reunite those unities. So we are a disunited, we are a dysregulated, we are an unsymmetrical entity, and our sin has alienated us from those symmetries, and it is through it is a task of us in the world to go through the world and to reunite those symmetries. That is an extremely Kabbalistic way of thinking. And it seems to me that Agrippa is getting a lot of this, maybe all of this, in some ways from the Kabbalistic tradition, because almost every element here is in some sense found in some version of the Kabbalistic story about how the human being came to be in the position that we are in. Now, how is that done? This is where Agrippa is very different than the Kabbalists. But what Agrippa thinks has to be done, of course, is that we must study nature. We must study nature. And secondly, we have to delve into the hidden dimensions of nature by discovering what Agrippa calls the arcana. Now, if you've seen the episode I made this week on Agrippa's theory of alchemy, that is exactly what he says in his alchemical works, that there are two forms of efficient causation, one by nature and one by the arcanum. And there are two kinds of philosophers, one that studies nature at its most apparent, at its most exoteric, and then there's natural philosophers that study nature at its esoteric, and they discover the inner arcanum that is hidden within nature. Here again, we have an exact symmetry of what Agrippa says in his dialogue on man, and also what he says in what is probably a work being generated about alchemy sometime also during the Italian period, if Maton is to be correct, if Maton is correct, and I believe that he in fact is. So there we have a case where I think again, we have another vote in the confidence that the De Arte Chimica is in fact written by Agrippa, because they exactly mirror each other in the vocation of man, which is to say finding the arcana hidden in nature. How do we do that? Again, this is part of Agrippa's mystical epistemology. Agrippa's mystical epistemology is not founded on either rationalism or empiricism. right? This is not an empirical strategy, nor is it a rationalistic one. For all the reasons that we've talked about at length with Agrippa's distaste for dialectic. In fact, as we'll see next week, Agrippa literally says that dialectic comes from the devil. On the 3 ways of knowing God, he says literally, like, dialectic comes from the devil. At any rate, what it is predicated upon is fides. Now, I know everyone's going to want me to translate that as faith. But again, part of the reason why I do not want to translate this as faith is because this word, especially for us Americans, most of us have been raised around evangelicals, we have taken the word faith, especially in the science wars debates and stuff like that, or the faith versus science debate, is that faith is misunderstood by so many people as believing in things with the lack of evidence, or having to simply to believe in stuff when you have no evidence. That's not what faith means for Agrippa, nor is it what it means in normal traditional theology, both Eastern and Western Christianity. Rather, faith is a way of being in the world whereby one fundamentally trusts, right, at an ontological level, one trusts in God, and that insofar as one has that trust in the divine, there is a kind of leap that occurs such that one trusts that one observes cause and effect. The cause and effect are not happening on their own. The cause and effect are an expression of the divine grace, of the divine love. And by trusting in God, you can know in a robust way that cause and effect are real because God isn't a deceiver. It's not you're trusting it. It's not that you're seeing it and your eyes and your calculating machines or your equipment don't lie to you. Those can all lie to you. None of those are fundamentally trustworthy, but God is fundamentally trustworthy. And therefore, the comportment of oneself in the world as an act of faith, as a way of being in the world, allows one to say, God is expressing God's love, God is expressing God's grace, and for instance, the intelligibility of the world, and for instance, the mechanism of the world. In the world, the way the world works, all of that is an expression of God, and I can only encounter that and understand it and appreciate it and learn about it if I come at it from a position of fides, because I can't trust my eyes. I can't trust my ears. I can't trust the fallen nature of all of the kind of human being that I am. But what I can trust is that in a fundamental way, God is not a deceiver. And therefore, I am in a relationship with nature, mediated or in relationship via, right, God. That in the mediation of the relationship with God, that mediates my relationship with nature, and therefore that closes a circuit. And it is in that closed circuit, right, that I can have some truth about the nature of reality. But it is only predicated upon faith. It is only possible in faith. So again, here we have a glimpse into Agrippa's epistemology. It is an epistemology not underwritten by rationalism, not underwritten by dialectic for damn sure, and not underwritten by empiricism, but underwritten by fides. And this is, I think, again, it shows that Agrippa already is moving in the direction of the sort of the radical skepticism that we're going to see later. But again, what I want to impress upon you is that this so-called skepticism is less a skepticism in the way that we might think of David Hume, for instance. It is a skepticism born out of the fact that he thinks that alienated from faith, nothing can be known. And therefore, upon the foundation of everything is built upon fides. And then upon that, right, we can begin to generate knowledge. But without it, nothing can be known. So it is fideism in the sense, not in the fideism in the sense of, the classic credo ad absurdum. I believe it because of absurd stuff. It does not believe it when I don't have evidence for it. It's that for Agrippa, the evidence itself, the fact that you have evidence for anything, that the fact that the universe is intelligible is an act of divine grace, and you can only encounter that through faith. Otherwise, it could all just be, this all could just be chaos, and this all could be the work of a demonic deceiver, a la Descartes. So, again, we have a glimpse into his epistemology, and his epistemology, of course, is underwritten by faith, and of course, or fides. And fides, of course, is sitting upon a deeper structure, and you'll be unsurprised to know that deeper structure, of course, is the act of love, which we've already seen in the first text. So faith, hope, love. Now, is that is that Agrippa? Are we disappointed that Agrippa is in some sense so pious? We shouldn't be so shocked. But the fact that Agrippa is using an extremely Christian formula shows, right, that he's actually going in a radical way, radix from the Latin word for root. He's going really deep into the fundamentals of Christianity in a way that was all very much alive at the time. Remember, Agrippa's living in the crisis of the Reformation. Everybody's thinking about getting back to the roots. What are the roots for Agrippa? Agrippa says, let's get back to the roots of authentic, deep, ancient Christianity. And what are those roots? The roots are going to be love. The roots are going to be faith. They're going to be these deep, deep ideas. And I think that this is a point where Agrippa is thinking also in this kind of Reformation kind of way, where he's like, I need to get back to the authentic Christianity because whatever's going on in those buildings is not authentic Christianity. It's dialectic. That stuff is from the devil. And so what is authentic? Love, faith. And again, what is Agrippa reading? What is the most importantly looming in his mind in this period? I think it's Paul. I think it's Romans. I think that that is the stuff that Agrippa is really thinking about, really wrestling with. But of course, it's not just Romans. It's not just Paul. It's Hermes Trismegistus. It's Kabbalah. Because authentic primitive Christianity is also going to have as an important adjunct, in some sense, perhaps as an important identity with the fundamental truths that have always been revealed in history. And those, of course, will be taken into Kabbalah. They'll be taken into Corpus Hermeticum. And Agrippa's fusing them together. And I think in a very interesting, very subtle, sometimes not so subtle way as we saw in the Pavia lecture, but in a very interesting way. And I'm very excited to be getting into these other texts of Agrippa. I'm really excited to get these out into the world, actually. Dan and Trail and I are getting these out into the world because I think this gives us a vision of Agrippa that most of us have never seen. We always get the vision of Agrippa that's either De Incarnatudine, the radical skepticism, or we get the sort of machine gun style uh, uh, occultism that we find in the 3 books of occult philosophy, where Agrippa is furiously writing off this stuff. Here we're getting a little bit slower, a little bit more careful, deeper analysis of what's really functioning in Agrippa's thinking. And I hope and I think that by studying these texts, eventually getting to the letters and translating those as well, we're getting a fuller, richer picture of a thinker, of a philosopher, of a mystic for whom, in many ways, I think we've only had bookends. But now I think we're getting some of the actual connective tissue, some of the deeper stuff in Agrippa. And I'm really excited to be turning next week to the 3 Ways of Knowing God, the most important book that Agrippa wrote during this period, his book on original sin. And eventually, of course, starting next week as well, we will also probably at least introduce the 1526 turn toward skepticism.